could we be given warning at the beginning of a programme if there's going to be anything about the Beatles, as all Beatle fans can make sure to listen, and have a chance to ring up other fans to make sure they are also listening?
Hi everybody, this is John here. This is Paul, George,
and Ringo.
And we're very happy to be on your program once again.
Welcome to our newest Beatles News Briefs, show number 104. Our special guest today is Andru Reeve, author of the newly revised Turn Me On Dead Man, the complete history of the Paul is Dead urban legend that alleges Paul McCartney was killed in a car accident in 1966 and was secretly replaced by a look-alike. Steve and Andru discuss its beginnings and development and how it has continued to live for 59 years, with clues being added even recently. And, as he often does, Steve brings you some Beatles news of interest. Now, here's Steve Marinucci.
Hi everybody, welcome to the show. I'm your host Steve Marinucci, and I'm glad you could be with us. If you think you know all of the Paul is Dead story that's been floating around since the mid-60s, well, maybe you don't. Andru Reeve, our guest today, is the author of the best and most comprehensive book on the subject called Turn Me On Dead Man, that's just been revised after 20 years. And would you believe there have been new clues added within the past few years? Here's my interview with Andru Reeve. Hello, everyone. I want to welcome to the show Andru Reeve, the author of the best and most comprehensive book on the Paul is Dead story, Turn Me On Dead Man, which was first published in 1994. It was then updated in 2004, and it's been updated again for the first time in 20 years. Andru, welcome to the show.
Hi, Steve. Good to talk to you again.
The fact we're still talking about this 56 years later is absolutely mind-blowing. I remember when I first heard about it, it was in an underground newspaper, and they had printed a whole page of, I think it was a page of information on it. And from there it grew and grew. There were so many different facets to this thing. It's still amazing that we're still talking about it. Why has this thing survived?
I think people are always fascinated by sort of creepy, secret, conspiracy theories. And this is the granddaddy of at least celebrity conspiracy theories, I guess. And it's been that way since 1969. And it faded after I'd say about 3 weeks. It was a really strong rumor, and we didn't have the internet back then, so a rumor had a lot more life. Nowadays, you have a death rumor, and it's pretty much quashed after a day or two. Back then, it was not quashed. The Beatles did nothing to stop it. Paul didn't step forward for many, many days to deny it or get in front of a camera, until he, of course, was accosted by the Life magazine team that was sent to his Scottish farmhouse. And once they reached him there, he threw a pail of water on the photographer. And then he had a change of heart and came out and agreed to an interview. And he appeared as the cover of Life magazine. I believe it was the first week of November, and that pretty much ended the controversy. But for some reason, every Halloween, people talk about it again. There's fresh articles that appear in the newspapers or on the internet. And actually, you go on the internet now, and you can put in Paul is Dead, and you'll get hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of hits. And there are people still speculating about it, still coming up with new clues, because this was really all about the clues. The clues on the record album covers and in the songs. You played records backwards. I got the title for the book, Turn Me On Dead Man, because if you take Revolution 9 and you play the part where the guy says number 9, and you spin that backwards, you hear, turn me on, dead man, turn me on, dead man. And the college kids back then, basically, it was a game to them. They would be in their dorm rooms and they'd find another clue and they'd share it with their friends and they'd spread it around to other people at other colleges. And that's pretty much how it spread, word of mouth. and mostly among young people. And also the DJs had a hand in it. The DJs on the radio always looking for something new to talk about. Russ Gibb is generally credited as the guy who really, he wasn't the first to talk about it, but he was an impresario in Detroit, Michigan. He was into promotion. He promoted rock bands. And he thought, well, this is a great way to promote the radio station I'm working at, WKNR. And he was working a slow Sunday morning, and he got this phone call from Tom Zarsky, it turns out is his real name. And Tom asked, well, what is this all about?
Mm-hmm.
And so Russ on the air took number 9 and played it backwards live. And that just caused an avalanche of phone calls. And that's pretty much how it started, from his radio show, and then it spread across the country from Detroit to both coasts, and then finally around the world.
Getting back to what you said about the Beatles didn't really dismiss it at first. In the book, you talk about Paul actually arguing with Derek Taylor to not bother with it, to leave it alone. And I mean, that was kind of interesting that Derek Taylor is saying, look, you got to do something, you got to do something. And Paul is saying, no, we don't have to do anything.
They were used to people, coming up with all kinds of crazy theories about the Beatles, and they figured out that the best thing to do was ignore it and it would go away. Like, for instance, when the Beatles first came over, people said they were really bald and they were wearing wigs.
Right.
So the Beatles just said, forget about it. Don't even comment on it. And of course, that blew over. And there's all kinds of rumors like that. When it was disclosed that John Lennon was married, they figured that might hurt their fame to admit that one of them was hitched. So they never talked about that if they didn't have to.
Right.
And so that was the idea, is that philosophy was baked into being a Beatle, was not to talk about things if you don't need to, and they will go away.
And then what was really strange was, as things went along and people came out with clues, the clues were inconsistent. I mean, anytime somebody had a clue, there was always a different version of the clue about the albums, for example. People were finding different things on the albums that they claimed were clues.
Strengthened their argument that he was dead, or something was wrong with Paul, or that he was a double.
Yeah.
And
I mean, it was really amazing how, if you were really listening, you probably could have figured out that this whole thing was crazy. And a lot of people actually took it very, very seriously.
it was a very strange time. You have to remember that there were kids in college, or even not in college, just hanging around with their friends. And it was a very real possibility that they could be drafted and go fight in Vietnam. So it was a really tumultuous time. And the Beatles were their heroes. They were kind of like gods in a way.
Mhm.
It did take on sort of a religious significance, this Paul is dead thing. The idea that Paul could be dead, but then be resurrected. And I talk about that in the book as well, the religious significance, the spiritual significance of his supposed death. And there were a lot of elements to this. It went beyond just that he was dead. There were things about him being resurrected, or that a double had taken his place. So it was very Baroque and very complicated and very complex. And that's part of the reason that I think it had staying power and why it kept interest. The fact that you could always find new clues. And as you pointed out, some of the clues made no sense at all. But if there's some way you could tie it to Paul, then it just sort of buffeted the argument that there was something different about Paul. And the Beatles, they sort of contributed to it, you have to admit, because, for instance, John Lennon, when he wrote the song Glass Onion, he says, "Here's another clue for you all."
Right.
Walrus was Paul. Why did he say that? Why did he pick on Paul? Why is Paul barefoot on the cover of Abbey Road? Why are eyes closed? Why is he out of step? Why is his back turned on the reverse of Sergeant Pepper? Why is it not George Harrison's back turned? So he's singled out on the album covers, and he's being singled out in some of these lyrics directly. And then the kids discovered indirectly supposedly, that you could play things backwards and it would say, Paul is a dead man, miss him, miss him, miss him.
And they even admitted later on that, some of what came from them was intentional too. They kind of enjoyed the whole craziness, that people were doing. You think?
I think that once the thing got started and they saw that records were selling, people were, the interest in the Beatles never really flagged, but I think it got a little bit of a bump because of this. Even though I don't put any credence in it, and if you ask me directly what I think about all this, I think that it's just a huge, huge cultural phenomenon. It's like a gigantic coincidence, and it's fascinating all the same, but I don't think that anybody's intention was to create this controversy or to invent this rumor. Now, people would argue with me, and people still argue with me to this day. There are websites that continue to state that this was intentional on the part of the Beatles. I don't really believe that, but that shows how strong this is. People still think that Lee Harvey Oswald was not the lone assassin, that there were other people
Right.
involved to this day.
Gotten into an argument at a Beatle convention about this?
Not at a convention, but online I have. People have, dissed me and disregarded my book and said my book is full of it because, everybody knows that Paul was replaced by a lookalike, which I find mind-blowing. How could you find somebody as talented as Paul McCartney, a lookalike? Billy Shears, supposedly, or William Campbell is another name. Supposedly, these people were winners of a Paul lookalike contest, and as soon as Paul died in a car crash in 1966, the surviving Beatles rushed to get this lookalike and press him into service and make him the new Paul McCartney.
That in itself is just beyond believable. For a guy as talented as McCartney was at that point in time when this whole thing started, it would be a major miracle to find somebody with his talent like that. And that's what they all say happened. It's crazy.
Of course, the conspiracy theorists, the cloisters, as they are sometimes affectionately known, they say, well, there are voice prints that some of these audiologists took voice prints of the singer of a song allegedly by Paul McCartney in 1964 and a singer of a song allegedly by Paul McCartney in 1967 after his alleged death in a car crash. And these audiologists claim that it's two different people. It's not Paul McCartney in each of these songs, that whoever sang in 1964 did not sing in 1967, that it's a different person. And they claim that the voice that Paul uses on, like, Oh Darling on Abbey Road is a completely different voice than he ever used before. So that supports the theory that this is not Paul McCartney, but it is, in fact, the lookalike who took his place.
I was going to respond to what you just said about some of the crazy ideas people brought up. One of the things that I remember, and I remember writing about it and really blistering it, was the DVD, The Last Testament of George Harrison, which you mentioned in the book or in the afterword. I think it's in the afterword, actually. That was the craziest thing ever. And, it was presented as if it was a real theory. And then there were things that should have convinced people, like the Christopher Glenn interview on the Mike Douglas show with Michael McCartney. I mean, that should have ended the whole thing right there, and people still didn't believe that stuff. Even having a family member to argue it. And another time, Peter Asher argued it, and they still didn't believe it. They were still holding on to it.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the Last Testament of George Harrison, which the conceit is that George Harrison on his deathbed confesses everything to this gentleman named Joel Gilbert, who created the documentary, and it's on a cassette tape. And Joel Gilbert got it. And it's like a really bad impersonation of George Harrison, if you ever listen
Yes.
to it. But supposedly George Harrison, if you listen to this, confesses. He says, yes, that's true. Paul was killed in a bloody car crash in 1966. And we did replace him with a guy that we knew named William Campbell. I can't remember what name it was. It was probably William.
I did see that. But the thing with that is the impersonation of George Harrison was just so obviously wrong.
Right,
It was
but the fact that this guy Joel Gilbert went through the trouble of creating this DVD. I mean, he created it and manufactured it and sold it. I mean,
Mhm.
he went to a lot of effort for this, and a lot of people were happy to buy it. I think he did rather well. And
He also he did something similar with Elvis too. He had an Elvis is Alive DVD, and and I think he also did something with Dylan, because I think somebody told me about, I don't remember what the Dylan thing was, but I know he did an Elvis is Alive DVD as well. So I mean, and it was
people
just,
love that. People love to hear that their celebrities are fallible because we build up these celebrities into these godlike figures. Part of the appeal of something like a death rumor, like the Paul is dead rumor, is this is a chance for us to tear them down and take them down to our level. They're not immortal. They can die just like us. And in fact, if you accept the fact that Paul McCartney is a human being, of course he's going to die someday. But
Mhm.
the point is he was young and vital back then. He was 27 years old or 26 years old. It made us feel better about ourselves, especially as I mentioned before, a lot of these kids were afraid of being drafted and going to Vietnam and being killed
Right.
in a war. And so they're really scared of their own mortality. So it kind of gave them comfort to take their celebrity, their Paul McCartney, their idol, and make him die, and then resurrect him. Because obviously he's not dead. He's alive on the record album covers. He's alive in the songs. So there's like this resurrection principle that's been pressed into service as well. So
Mm.
it's just a simple death rumor. It's this Baroque thing where he's killed and then resurrected, sort of like Christ, where Christ is killed and then he's reborn 3 days
But
later.
it's a whole different thing. That
Oh,
was
it's not the same thing at all, but that's the whole thing. The Beatles have created a new religion. It's beyond Christianity.
right.
If you ever read, for instance, Fred Labor's article that he did 2 days after the Russ Gibb radio broadcast, he kind of touches on the religious aspects. In fact, a lot of the clues, the original clues, and the whole idea of resurrection.
Is that in your book?
Yes, I
Okay.
reprint his article in there, but through his kind permission. And Fred
Okay.
Labor is an interesting guy too. I don't know if you know that, or the audience who's listening right now. Fred Labor went on to become a musician himself,
Oh,
a rather
yeah.
famous musician. He's known as Too Slim, and he's in a band called Riders in the Sky.
Right.
They're
And
like a West.
they're very well known in country music.
Yeah,
Very
they
well known.
won some Grammys recently. They won a Grammy for the Toy Story 2. Then they did a song for Monsters Inc. and won a Grammy for that as well.
So you've just updated the book for the first time since 2004, 20 years ago. What's new? What have you added to the book?
Well, a lot of it is what I brought out in 2004. It's I'd say 90% of it is that book.
Hmm.
There are sections in the book about websites that maybe no longer exist. So I talk about them instead of in present tense, they're in past tense.
Hmm.
And some of the things that are not really in existence anymore in that regard, I've taken out of the book. A lot of the updates are in the afterword. I have a 4-page afterword in the book, and I sort of touch base with all the people we've lost since the earlier edition. I do mention that Russ Gibb has passed on and Christopher Glenn. And I mention some of the later appearances of Paul McCartney. He discusses the rumor briefly with James Corden during his carpool karaoke segment. That was just a couple years ago.
Hmm.
So I do mention that. The first edition came out through a small publisher in Michigan, Popular Culture Inc. And the second edition I published myself. And then this new one has come out through Genius Books and they're an outfit out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But they have a lot of great books, by the way, if
Mm.
you're into music or culture. So I do recommend that anybody that's listening in to go to the Genius Books website to order my book, but also to take a look around at what else the publisher offers.
I don't want to give too much of the afterword away, but one of the things I found in looking through it was you actually have Paul is Dead clues for now and then. And that blew me that something so recent. I mean, that's how much this thing is holding on, that people have found now clues in now and then.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing is people keep finding new clues, not only for now and then, but also going back to the original 11 or so Beatles albums, they still find clues and add to the mountain of clues that we have. In my book, I have an appendix where I mention 140 clues, which I think is quite a lot. And I'd say 125 of those are contemporary to that time period, to 1969. I kept to that principle that I wanted the clues to be clues that the kids did find at that time. But I also added about 15 clues that are more recent that people have uncovered. But as I point out, or as you've pointed out, people keep finding new clues all the time. I could probably create a list of 200 clues now if I wanted to.
You said you go back through the whole string of albums. Are you talking about going all the way back to Meet the Beatles? Where's the earliest clues come from?
The earliest clues, generally speaking, the timeline of Paul is Dead, generally accepted is that Paul died in 1966, November
Right.
9th. There's an exact date, November 9th, 1966.
Wow.
Supposedly that's when Paul died in a car crash. The coincidence I uncover in the book, which I do mention, is that that's the exact date that John Lennon met Yoko Ono for the first time, which I thought was fascinating. I don't know if that was intentional for making that the date of Paul's death or if that's just a coincidence, but I did uncover that those two events happened on the same day. One is a true event, John meeting Yoko, but the other one is the supposed event of Paul dying in the car crash.
Right.
So most of the clues don't really go back before Sergeant Pepper's. Supposedly, Sergeant Pepper is the first album to
Right.
contain clues. But I do in the book mention a couple of earlier albums for clues. For instance, just the fact that Yesterday and Today, which it was an American only compilation album, the original cover was, of course, the Butcher cover, which had a very bloody kind of theme to it. If
Hmm.
I think most of your listeners are familiar with that, anybody that's a real Beatles fan knows about the Butcher cover where the Beatles posed with hunks of meat and baby dolls, decapitated baby dolls, and
Hmm.
they're wearing butcher smocks. The Beatles actually wanted to use that for the cover. That was part of a big photography session where they did a lot of artsy kind of photography. And they just plucked that photo out and said, we want this on the cover of the Yesterday and Today compilation. The album actually came out with that cover. So a lot of people include that as a clue. I don't know why, because that really has nothing to do with Paul being dead. It's just has a death imagery on it. So that
Right.
is considered a clue sometimes. There are a lot of songs where the Beatles mention cars, like Baby You Can Drive My Car, you were in a car crash and you lost your hair, those kind of things.
Right.
And so anything that mentions a car or anything that mentions a car crash or anything that mentions death, like will you still believe it when he's dead? Just little lyric fragments are considered clues. So some of those lyric fragments do predate the supposed death of Paul McCartney. And I have thrown those into my list, but I don't really consider them real clues, as the clues really start with Sergeant Pepper, and then they go on to the White Album, Magical Mystery Tour, and pretty much Abbey Road. Just those four albums are the big four for the clues.
Which really adds to the craziness of the whole thing, that there's actually clues from before Pepper. But of course, I'm sure the logic for that goes, it was all a plot by the Beatles. So, but yeah, it's weird. It's definitely weird. Where can people get the new version of the book?
The book is available in the usual places. I don't know if it's actually come into Barnes and Noble yet, but it will be carried by Barnes and Noble and the Strand bookstore in New York. Of course, it's on Amazon if you want to go to Amazon. But I really would like people to go to the publisher's website, which is Genius Books. Go to that website. You'll find my book there, and you'll find a bunch of other great books. We do have YouTube now, and we do have other internet sources where you click on Paul is Dead, you're going to find hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of websites. And a lot of these folks have gone to the trouble of actually playing all these things backwards and embedding little clips in on their website where you can click on.
There were actually bootlegs that put together a lot of that stuff in audio. I don't know how easy they would be to find today, but yeah, there were bootlegs back years ago for that stuff.
There are CDs available that have all of the Paul is Dead novelty songs on it too, which is something we have not discussed.
How many were there?
There were 4 or 5 novelty songs.
Really?
One of the novelty songs supposedly is called Saint Paul. It was by Terry
Yes.
Knight. Knight was he was in Terry Knight in the Pack, and then he helped form Grand Funk Railroad and was their manager for the first few albums before they kicked him out. Between him leading Terry Knight in the Pack and forming Grand Funk, he had a little brief solo career, and he put out a couple of singles. And one of his goals was when Apple Records was started by the Beatles, he went over to England to see if he could join Apple Records. And he saw what was going on, and Apple Records by then was already collapsing. And so he decided that Paul was like a saint holding everything together. So he wrote this song about Saint Paul, and he came back and recorded it for Capitol Records. And it's really not about Paul being dead, but what is a saint? Right? Isn't a saint somebody who's been basically glorified after death? And so I tried to interview him. I was not able to, but he said to other people that it was not about him dying, that it was just a ode to Paul's determination to keep the Beatles together and what he witnessed when he was over in England. But a lot of people consider that a Paul is Dead novelty song. And a lot of people consider that part of the beginning of the rumor because it came out well before Russ Gibbs' radio broadcast.
One of the other stories this whole thing started was the way the disc jockeys picked up on it. You mentioned Russ Gibb, but another at WABC actually got fired on the air for that.
That's correct. Roby Young actually made an air check of the night he was carrying on about the Paul is Dead hoax, rumor, whatever you want to call it, live on the air on WABC in New York in the middle of the night. He figured, okay, it's the middle of the night. I'm the overnight guy. No one's going to stop me, so I can talk about whatever I want, even though Rick Sklar, the manager of WABC, told him not to. Says, we are not going to give this any credence, this Paul is Dead thing. So we are not talking about it, and I forbid you from talking about it. But Roby said, you know what? I'm going to go on the air and talk about it. I'm Roby Young. I can talk about it. So he went on the air and he talked about the rumor. And then Rick Sklar heard this and he rushed to the station and yanked him off the air. But the air check exists. And actually, if you go to my Facebook page, I've been posting fresh content every day. And I posted the Roby Young air check.
Yeah, that's an amazing, that whole chapter is an amazing, with him. I mean, he was really ranting. I can understand why they pulled him off the air. He didn't sound very sane. I mean,
He sounded like he was losing his marbles.
Right. I know that was a very, I mean, other disc jockeys talked about it too, but not the way he did.
A lot of disc jockeys and a lot of stations decided that they were going to use it for their own self-promotion. And it was amazing how many radio stations played along. They gave their disc jockeys clearance to go ahead and put together specials. If not talk about it live, which they did also, but they also went into their little production booths and created 1-hour specials that would air like on the weekends pre-taped with all the clues playing backwards and everything. Russ Gibb had his over at WKNR that he did with a couple of his co-workers, John Small and Dan Carlisle. They all together called Eric Clapton and got sound bites from him, called Derek Taylor, got sound bites from him, played the songs backwards on the air or on the documentary special.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of stations did that throughout the country. And there's a bunch of those. If you go onto eBay, you can find them. You can buy the cassettes or CDs that people have made of these air checks. And it's fascinating. There's a lot of them out there. There's dozens of them. Put this in the book. The Beatles themselves put out these little magazines in the UK, because you see at the bottom here, it says price 2 shillings.
They were reprinted. The reprints were available here because I picked up the whole set that way.
This is original from England from February of 1967. So
Right.
This is 2 years before the controversy really started taking off. This is 2 years, more than 2 years, 2.5 years before Russ Gibbs' radio broadcast. I reprint this in my book, and it basically says, stories about the Beatles are always flying around Fleet Street. The 7th of January was very icy with dangerous conditions on the M1 motorway linking London with the Midlands, and towards the end of the day, a rumor spread throughout London that Paul McCartney had been killed in a car crash on the M1. But of course, there was absolutely no truth to it at all, as the Beatles press officer found out when he telephoned Paul's St. John's Wood home and was answered by Paul himself, who had been at home all day with his black Mini Cooper safely locked up in the garage. So that is the Beatles' own magazine reporting on this rumor 2.5 years before Russ Gibb. So is this the start of it? Maybe.
Anyway, Andrew, this has been a lot of fun. Good luck with the book. And yeah, the fact that we're still talking about this so many years later is crazy.
And we're going to still be talking about it 100 years from now.
Yes, I would think we will. This is not, one piece of Beatle folklore that's never going to go away. I've seen other books, but yours goes through it more than any of the others. And it has more in-depth information on this whole thing.
I devoted my life to it when I first started. I really did. 3 years from 1988 to 1991. That's all I did every day, making phone calls, going to the Library of Congress and digging through old files, old newspapers. I put my whole life on hold just to work on this because it was so important to me. And I really wanted to do it right. I didn't want to do a half-assed job.
Anyway, thank you again. This has been fun. And if you're listening, we've got more, so stay tuned. And now here's some Beatle news. Disney Plus has announced that the newly updated Beatles anthology will air over 3 nights from November 26th to 28th. Each night will feature 3 parts for a total of 9, adding 1 to the original 8 that aired in 1995. The expanded version has been restored by Peter Jackson's Park Road Post. ABC described the series as Apple Corps' landmark documentary exploring the life and times of the most influential and beloved bands of all time, as told by the Beatles themselves, and said it will offer, quote, an unprecedented and intimate view of the Beatles' legendary trajectory and inner workings. Rather than post all the discs of the newly released John Lennon Power to the People box set at once on the music services, the Lennon estate has staggered the postings of the box set, first with the first 2 discs of the 1-to-1 concert, then 1 disc each of the New York City Evolution documentary, Elements Mixes, and Studio Jam. The newest one, which is dropping this week, is the Live Jam disc. Listening to the discs in this fashion really makes the listener concentrate more on the music, and it makes, for example, the Studio Jam disc, which we didn't appreciate that much out of the box, much more enjoyable. If you were on our Beatles News and Information group on Tuesday, November 4th, you might have caught the announcement that the Pinnacle concert venue in Nashville released some extra tickets for Paul McCartney's show on Thursday. Thanks to Jane Tate for alerting us so that we could pass the word along. Hope some of you got tickets to the show. Yoko Ono's been involved with the annual Hungerthon for many years, and the London estate announced it's doing it again this year. The program, 40 years old this year, at hungerthon.org, raises money for a hunger-free world. You can also sign up for a 5K run and bid on celebrity auction items. Other partners involved include Bruce Springsteen and Sirius XM Radio. Again, go to hungerthon.org. Each day, NEMS Enterprises Limited posts vintage Beatles-related ads on Facebook, many of which we share with those in our Beatles News and Information group. Another reason to join us if you haven't already. On November 4th, they posted an ad for the Beatles portable record player, which was listed for $29.95 in 1964. I don't even want to know how. I can just guess how much that is now, but in any event. They also posted ads for Beatles sandwiches and candy bars. The candy, believe it or not, had images from the Beatles cartoon show on 6 different wrappers. I don't remember seeing those. Anyway, collect them all. May Pang's last photo exhibit of the year opens November 7th, Friday, at 1 Martine Gallery in White Plains, New York. As always, May will be there in person. If you're nearby, stop in. And there's some Beatle news you can use. If you have a news item you want us to mention, write BeatlesNewsBriefs@gmail.com and we will certainly take a look.
And one final thing. When we were discussing the John Lennon Power to the People box set in show number 103, we weren't really clear on what John and Yoko's status was in America after he got his green card. So we contacted Michael Wiles, the son of Leon Wiles, the attorney who worked to get John Lennon his green card and who wrote the whole situation up in his book, John Lennon versus the USA, a book we highly recommend. But the answer is that John got permanent residency status. Yoko Ono also got permanent residency status. We thank Michael Wiles for getting this information to us.
Thanks very much for listening to our podcast today. If you enjoyed our program, we'd really appreciate a positive review at the place where you get your podcasts. Apple and Google love positive reviews, and it really helps us. If you don't already, please subscribe to our show so you'll get our newest shows right away. We have some great shows coming up. We would love to hear your suggestions for the show, so please write to us at BeatlesNewsBriefs@gmail.com or catch us online on Facebook in our Beatles News and Information group. If you've missed any of our past shows, you can hear them at marinucci.podbean.com. And please tell your friends about us. We appreciate you all for listening. Now here again is Steve Marinucci.
And that's it for today. Thanks for joining us. This is Steve Marinucci saying,
Be seeing you.